Hello.
Hi.
How's your day going?
It's good. It's been pretty good. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, busy?
Yeah, my husband is delayed getting home from his latest trip, which is not unusual. But I had like a flurry of text messages this morning,
Yeah.
as I'm like buttering toast and getting the kids to school. So yeah, this was a good time because it gave me like an hour to just refocus and recenter myself after all that.
He's probably like, Megan, I need you to change this, update this. Okay, here's the details.
It's madness, it's like rerouting flights, and if they don't get out today, they have to wait till Friday.
Oh
And
my
so
goodness, and it's only
yeah.
Tuesdays.
So I leave on Saturday, and otherwise I'd have to cancel my trip. So that was my morning. How about yours?
My morning has been peaceful, somewhat. Yes, there's obviously certain things that you got to do and catch up on, but overall, you know what? The emails have been slower today, which is kind of nice.
Good. That's great. We have to take those kind of breaks when we can get them because life doesn't always let us do that.
It really doesn't. It really doesn't. Paul's your husband. So Paul's in Greenland or Iceland right now?
Greenland.
Greenland.
Yeah.
Wow. Have
Yeah.
you been out there?
Well, now he's flying to Copenhagen. Um, no, I have not ever been, and it's his favorite place in the world
Yeah.
outside of home. And so I'd love to get there sometime and experience it. It looks just so profoundly beautiful. And yeah, and if like based on all his travels, if he says it's the most beautiful place he's ever been,
That says something, doesn't it?
it
Yes.
does. Yeah, yeah.
And I think he does his courses out there as well, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's what he's been there
Oh, I
for.
say okay.
So he's just led two photography workshops back to back for Offbeat, our other photo company. And then he had 4 days at the end of all of that to do a contract tourism Greenland. So
Oh my
um,
goodness.
yeah, so now he's on his way.
Yes. For the listeners here, Megan, you're an author of many books. You're a mother of two daughters, and obviously a wife to Paul, which we've had on the podcast prior to. So thank you for doing this. And to get started, you moved from Ottawa in 2005 to Alberta.
That's correct.
How did that become a choice, saying Alberta is going to be the place I would like to move, and specifically Banff?
Right. So it wasn't necessarily a permanent move when I first came to
Okay.
Alberta. I I was in my second year of university, and the previous summer, I had been window washing as my job
Mhm.
in my hometown, and I had a great group of people to work with. But I think washing windows for a whole summer, and that combined with I had a cousin who was working out in the Rockies at that time, and at this lodge at Bow Lake. And I think my summer of washing 400 houses and hearing about my cousin's experiences in the Rockies combined and just kind of brought up this
Mm,
yearning in me for something different. And so I bounced it off my parents and ended up applying for a job at that same lodge that
okay.
my cousin had worked at. And so when I first moved to Alberta, I didn't know that it would be a permanent thing. I moved out for a summer between school years, and it became more permanent later.
Interesting. So once you finished school, I'm guessing then it became permanent. Was this a lonely journey at first, or did you fall in love with writing afterwards, photography afterwards, the nature afterwards, or was it always something that was within you?
That's a really good question. Um, I think the mountain experience certainly brought things out in me that were already there.
Mm,
Um, some of which were a surprise to me. The writing had been an interest for a long time. It wasn't until my fourth year of university, though, that I had several people in my life tell me, have you ever thought about working in writing and editing? And so sometimes others need to plant that seed.
yeah.
But I think my mountain experience opened me up to the possibility of creating a different future for myself than the one that I had kind of grown up thinking that I would be living.
How did you know that Alberta was going to be home? And this is the life that you wanted to create for yourself rather than the life that you would have had back home.
Right. I grew up in an environment that I describe as having kind of a predictive future. And by this, I mean, I grew up in a more conservative environment in a church community where from a young age, it felt like it was fairly dictated, but it was also something that I absorbed for myself. So, in that regard, I take responsibility for the fact that as much as this was the culture I grew up in, it was also something that I didn't question. And so, there's a pattern to it. And it usually involves, you go to school, you get married, you have kids, and then you find a stable job. And most people in my life had that kind of 9 to 5 arrangement.
Mhm.
And so I didn't know that Alberta would be home. Paul and I decided to move to Banff in 2008 on a more permanent basis, but we were really going to give it a year. He was sure he wanted to come back to the mountains. I was finished school, and I said, well, why not? Just give it a shot. So we came in 2008 for a year, and then we just never left. And so in that regard, it nothing really felt like it was a really intentional decision. And I know it sounds a little cliche to say I just did the next right thing, but that's really what happened. At all of these pivotal moments, I just decided what feels good and what doesn't. And I didn't intend to reject, for lack of a better word, my kind of childhood structure. It just kind of happened.
It formed.
It just formed, and it formed by really listening to myself and what felt right for me. And the 9 to 5, I worked in that environment for a few years for sure. But at every step, I was trying to pivot that existence so that I could free up more time and ultimately take more control of that time.
Right. And take control of your destination of where you want to go in your journey of this one life, which is beautiful. When you look at that move in general, it fascinates me because, entrepreneurs, artists, writers, whatever you are in life, um, you're getting out of your safety zone. You're getting away from comfort. For Paul and yourself, Paul being a photographer, you being a photographer, writer, content creator, was that nerve-wracking? That, oh my God, we're putting ourselves out there, and who knows what that energy will be received like and how
Mm.
we will be perceived out there.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever thought of it as, nerve-wracking, though I'm sure I would put different words on it.
Yeah.
I should say one thing that I don't really call myself a photographer in that I'm like an iPhone photographer. I like to joke that I'm kind of like the most knowledgeable non-photographer in the business.
You
'Cause
really are.
I do run a photography business,
Yes.
but I'm not myself a photographer, but I understand the ins and outs.
Yes.
I'm pretty good at curating a gallery. All of these things. So I'll just make sure that that's clear. But
Well, you have a great mentor with you and a life partner.
oh, exactly. I have the best teacher I could
Yes, you
imagine.
do.
So I I have certainly though wondered how things are resonating when I put things out there. And often I feel like, especially with writing,
Mhm.
it's quite a broken feedback loop. In photography, I've noticed there's a lot of instant gratification because of how easy it is for people to respond to an image. But with writing, people have to actually sit and read something. They have to invest a lot more time in reading what you're putting out there. And so for many years, I didn't have a lot of feedback. And to some degree, I still don't. But you have to learn how to be okay with that your job is just to put it out there. And I never assumed that it's just kind of bouncing in the void and nobody's seeing it or resonating with it. And occasionally I'll get a message back that speaks to it. And so I had to learn how to be okay
Yeah.
with this, what I call the broken feedback loop. But on the flip side, it has also made me make greater efforts to provide feedback to people, especially writers, and say, hey, this really spoke to me. I really loved what you did here, because it's something that writers really yearn for.
It's just so beautiful in this day and age to meet individuals like yourself that are writing still, because it's like you said, it's like photos, Instagram, social media, and short captions. But to meet people that are actually taking the time to put what's in their minds out there on paper or on the computer, it's just a beautiful journey. You've written some children's novels, and obviously now it's Lights to Guide Me Home, which, by the way, is amazing. Almost on the book. It's right here. Shout out.
Thank you.
Where does this come from in your imagination? How do these things come up? And then you say to yourself, these are valuable thoughts, and I will put them down on paper. Like, what is your process? Because I think that's a beautiful journey on its own to create something like this.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's as cut and dried. The whole writing process is in itself a journey. And just as I mentioned before about the feedback loop, every memoirist has to decide that their story is worth telling and that it has value in and of itself, because otherwise you're just going to spiral down into some deep, dark hole, feeling like you're lacking worth, and that, well, what's my story amidst all this sea of stories?
Yes.
And so in itself was part of the writing process, was learning to find value in what I was putting out there, and deciding as well that, ultimately I'm doing this for myself and my daughters in particular, who aren't allowed to read it yet.
Yeah.
I told my eldest not until she's 15. But I ultimately had to decide what I was doing it for, because I couldn't rely on the readers.
It's very touching, and at the end of the day, it's real, it's authentic. You're putting yourself in a vulnerable situation, which I think I wish more people did. It makes individuals realize that, you know what, you're not alone. And this journey, it's like you said, the journey off the beaten track in life, love, adventure, and parenting. That's all we have, and we have to embrace it and learn from one another. And obviously, storytelling is one of the most beautiful ways to do so. What was one of your favorite chapters in this book?
There were some chapters that are my favorites now because of how hard they were to write, and you feel like you persevered. And the first chapter in particular was actually one of the last that I finished, because it was just very challenging to summarize so much into 24 pages or however many it is. But a chapter that really sticks out to me is the Easter Island Rapa Nui chapter. It's just even from a travel perspective, it's just such an incredible place. Yeah. And then to have been able to take my children there, adds this whole other layer to it for me. And also it was a chapter where I felt like I could really, I've explained to a few people now that within the book, there's the outer journey, there's the physical travel through this world and what people would expect from a travel log, but there's this simultaneous parallel inner journey. And for me, I feel like that chapter is where those things really came together really nicely. It came very naturally. And I was also able to work on that chapter while I was on Easter Island. Interesting. Because that was where I signed my book contract.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing.
So that's really special, because otherwise I was writing about events of the past. Right. And I had already been dabbling in the book at this point. I just hadn't yet signed a contract. But that was where I, signed off on the idea. And then from then on, I knew, okay, here's what I'm working towards.
Mhm.
And there's a sequence in the book where I describe a time, a rainy day where Paul, shoves me out the door and gives me some writing time. And so I guess what the reader wouldn't know is just how significant that was, that I was able to work on the book while I was there. And, that it's really helps with description and
Mhm.
really tapping into your authentic feelings about both yourself and about the place.
Well, you made the reader immerse into the senses as well, which was, like you said, it's not the physical journey, it's the soul, it's the synchronicity of where you're headed and moving. And we grow through what you're going through, which is beautiful.
That's really well put. Thanks.
Yeah, my pleasure. I always get curious when you look at a cover of a book, why the title and why this cover, this artwork? It's beautiful, by the way.
Thank you. So I was thinking about this yesterday. The title really comes from the first chapter of when I was living at Bow Lake, and I started going off on little hikes by myself, and sometimes I'd come back after dark, and I didn't really need a headlamp if I was on the lakeshore trail because I literally had this lodge and its lights guiding me back. And and this kind of combined with this other idea I had to use navigational metaphors and wayfinding metaphors throughout the book
Hmm.
as a way of attaching some metaphor to the lessons that I was learning and giving readers a visual, and and also just showing that there isn't one way of navigating off the beaten track. It's a combination of tools that we gather over the course of our lives. And so that's where the title came from. But I remember, I think I spoke it aloud, actually hiking that trail just a few years ago. And it just rolled off the tongue. And then I did a Google search, I did an Amazon search, and remarkably, that phrasing hadn't been used for a book.
Hmm.
Uh, the cover was inspired by some other book covers that I've seen out there. I really didn't want a photograph on the cover,
Mm.
and I think partially it's because of my association with a professional photographer. That I really felt that this needed to be
Right.
my piece, my offering to the world.
It just that analogy too, right? Lights to guide me home. You can think about the stars. You can think about that lodge at Bow Lake. You can think about it even deeper with the soul connection of, one day we're headed home. So,
Hmm. And I just feel so fortunate with my publisher that I essentially brought them this concept. Their designer is the one who
mhm.
created it, but it
Right.
was a collaborative process. And to have a publisher that is open to that is really wonderful because they're ultimately the ones who decide what a book looks like. And so just to see kind of my vision come true
Yeah.
and see it executed so elegantly as well was really, really a lot to me.
Like say one example is, I didn't want to associate myself with the photographer. When Paul is a powerhouse in what he does, and you're an amazing powerhouse in what you do, sometimes it can overlap. And again, people might blend things like, oh my God, like I had said earlier, photographer, but you're not, the business inside out. But you guys complement one another so well. How did you realize I can have my own voice, Paul can have his own voice, and we can both lead together forward? Because that's
Mm.
oftentimes hard to see in relationships, right?
Yeah, and you're asking questions about things that I don't know if I've ever articulated before. So forgive me if I struggle, but I have to give Paul a lot of credit that he's just so incredibly supportive of what I create and what I want to put out there. And this is all on top of I essentially run the administrative end of his business, and we have some part-time contractors who help us out, whom we're very grateful for. But because of all of his traveling, you could say I'm kind of the glue at Paul's Escape Photography. And so I'm also wearing that hat as much as I try to embody this one. And I feel like it's really up to me to decide that my work and my offerings are of value. And then it's something that I want to put out there. Um, and so it truly is a team effort. Um, and I guess part of it is really hinging on this this level of independence that we have from each other, which of course isn't such a great thing all the time. Because of our lifestyles and his travel schedule, it does mean an incredible amount of time apart. But it really comes down to like a deep respect for each other as individuals. And I think that's what I mean by independence, that we see that in each other, and we know that we're stronger together when we let each other live to that full potential.
No, and it's beautiful. I mean, we can see it in your work, we can see it in Paul's work. It's brilliant. I admire, and I've told Paul this too, is how do you guys go out there at night? And like you said, you were walking alone in the dark. I can't even go hiking alone in the broad daylight.
I'm not out like he is, though.
God.
I mean, we've got two kids, so if he's out at night, like I'm generally not out at night. That's really his gig.
Lights to guide me home. You remember the lodge at by Bow Lake? Is that, by the way, still around the lodge?
It is, yeah. It's now called the Lodge of Bow Lake. It used to be called Numtija Lodge.
Okay.
They've recently been there's a change in ownership, and they've recently rebranded. So it's still there, and yeah, I have the privilege of heading up there and visiting from time to time.
You're a pillar in the Alberta community, especially in the Rockies. How does that feel for you that, the invitation for purpose to showcase, to highlight, to document these moments in time?
I mean, it's really a privilege. It's also one that any journalist or any writer or photojournalist. I just listened to your episode with Leah Hennel, and it's really a lot of hard work as well, and sticking your neck out there and building relationships.
Mhm.
And whenever people come asking me for advice, it's like you really just it's really about creating relationships with people. Um, and that's where, for one, the stories come from, but also the level of trust to tell those stories in an accurate and holistic way. So, in that particular case, I was really also just going to the new pedestrian bridge as a community member. There were hundreds of people there
Oh my
for the
goodness.
ceremony, and on this stunning, beautiful late summer day. And, so I was also there just as a member of my
Mhm.
community.
Paul working with the tourism and you're doing the admin, and there's a lot of back and forth that people don't see. They see a finished product such as this book. You were, I think, the editor-in-chief of Where magazine?
I was actually the editor at the Canadian Rockies annual.
Do you miss those gigs though? Or you're able to do that?
Yeah, I do miss it. I had the privilege of I edited at the Canadian Rockies Annual, which I was the co-founder of for 5 or 6 years. And before that, I had worked with Highline magazine. I've also had a chance to work on the editorial staff with Alpinist.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, there's a lot of almost like adrenaline and buzz around storytelling in that capacity. And we weren't with the Canadian Rockies annual, we didn't focus a lot on news, which was an intention on my part as well, because I had little kids. I knew I didn't have the resources
No.
to keep up with news pieces. So we really focused on telling fresh stories that no one really was telling about the Rockies. Um, I do miss it, and there's also a part of me that you know with the timing of this book coming out, I just really needed to refocus
Mhm.
on what that would require of me. And in a way, I've spent a decade helping other people tell their stories as an editor. That's essentially the job of an editor, is helping others tell their stories or telling a story. This is the first time that I've really told my story, and I didn't want to shortchange myself on that.
Mhm. When you look back at mental health and mindset, how do you keep yourself sane through writing, to going back in time, remembering moments such as dark thoughts that we have, and then putting it on paper and then having to relive it and edit it? It's hard. Sometimes we try to suppress those feelings and say, I'm done. I don't want to think about it. And now, facing that fear is something that's admirable.
Yeah, it's definitely not something to overlook as part of a process for anyone who's looking at telling, this kind of a story. I had some really interesting experiences digging through those memories. I certainly underestimated what that would require. And there were a few times I actually was able to book in at a hotel here in Banff to do some mini writing retreats, because there were times I just could not get through certain portions of text without needing to like block myself out from the world for a few days.
Mhm.
And both times that I did that, I had some actual physical symptoms uh, as a stress response to what I was writing about. And so,
So like
you
heavy
know,
breathing or heart racing.
in that particular case, it was like a migraine that wouldn't lift, which is really frustrating when you're trying to work on a
Mm,
computer.
yes, the fog, right? That's
Yeah.
yeah.
And so I actually learned after the first instance of that. The second time I did a writing retreat, I actually booked like a massage and a chiro
Mhm.
appointment like during the retreat. But I've had to really learn the hard way in the last few years, how to take care of myself. That goes beyond my writing and divulging into my personal history and putting it out there to the public. I think we've all had to develop some new coping mechanisms, and
Mhm.
so I have a pretty robust toolkit now, you could say. A lot of it is just establishing boundaries for myself. I actually have a note here on my clipboard that literally says no hard things after 5 p.m.
Love it.
because as a parent of young children, like 5 p.m. is a tough time of day. You come
Mhm.
out of that, you're burnt out. And the last thing I need to do is tackle anything emotionally or mentally difficult in those evening hours, or I can promise you I won't sleep. Um,
Mhm.
so I'm, a firm believer in exercise as a great outlet. And I've also been seeing a counselor for a couple of years. I recognize that that was an untapped resource for me, and it's been a really wonderful experience to have someone external, especially as I was working on the book.
Mhm.
I didn't want those negative feelings coming up to kind of leak into my family life.
There's that stigma around getting help, finding a therapist, getting a counselor. It's scary. It's nerve-wracking to put yourself out there and say, yes, I'm going to do that. That's a first step. Because, oftentimes we think, well, do they really care about our feelings? Do they, there's so many things we can tell ourselves. That inner voice, it can take you all over the map. How did you say to yourself, I need to do this? And was it you that made these decisions, or was it someone saying to you, hey, Megan, you need to look at protecting yourself and protecting your energy?
Yeah, I can't quite remember how it all came together, but I think it was largely due to other people in my life being honest about their
Mhm.
tactics
Yeah.
and saying, I've been talking to somebody, and there is a stigma around it. And I always now I always say to people, because I'm very open about it, you go and see a doctor when you have a physical like problem, when
Hmm.
you've got an
Hmm.
injury of some kind. And so talking to a counselor or a therapist or psychologist, this is a way of attending to the wounds in our emotional well-being. And so I can't remember quite what triggered it, but certainly I was, probably going through a hard time when I finally decided I think I need to talk to somebody outside of, my husband and my friends.
Sure.
And that ultimately helped me to work through some of the passages in the book as well. Um, and and also treat myself with dignity through that process of being so vulnerable.
Do you feel like you found inner peace now, or are you still searching? And will we ever find that?
Yeah, I mean that is really like the ultimate journey of this book. And so I guess you'll have to read it to the end to see where I come around on that. But I think that I've learned over the years that things like harmony and peace and balance, I don't know if we're ever quite there. And it's not to be pessimistic about it. It's just to kind of keep our expectations in check and say, what's important is what's happening in this moment,
Yeah.
and acknowledging that things will never be perfect. And there's always a curveball coming our way. And it's really up to us to just go moment by moment. Um, and and also kind of recognizing that it's still worth striving for these things, even if we can't have them in every single moment. I think it was 2 days ago, I went from being like on a high because I had like a babysitter and I was able to go to the gym and do some work. And then like a couple hours later, suddenly I was just I'd flipped a switch and suddenly I just wasn't able to uh, be as patient with my children. And it happened on a dime, but I can't take that isolated incident and let it and bring it into the future. And yes, I may not feel harmonious in every moment of my life, but this is something still worth striving for.
Wow. It's true. Being present in the now, we can't change the past, and we often worry about the future. It's something to strive for. It's not easy, right? To stay here, present. We're always worried.
Mhm.
Yeah. Like you're worried about, is Paul getting home or is it gonna be Friday? I gotta leave Saturday.
Exactly.
Yeah, of
Yeah, I cannot let myself go there. And I do sometimes.
course. Yeah.
And how can you not?
Mhm.
But I think it goes back to kind of leading into our healthy coping mechanisms to get through those things. And knowing just what's ultimately out of our control.
Megan, for anybody that's wanting to be a writer, how did you guys know when to say no to certain projects or gigs? Because, we can get carried away, or new people will get carried away. And I don't want to say it like this, but often get taken advantage of, right? Well, you'll get exposure if you do this. And we've heard that before, the cliche.
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
How have you been able to now say no? And was there many gigs that you guys had to do in order to get to that place to say no?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I've often said, you can't pay your bills with exposure. Um, yeah, I think that a professional creative career is a journey like any others. You have to start somewhere.
Hmm.
And I did do some writing for free up front to get the clips I needed to then get published. It's like the catch-22 of publishing. You need to be published to get published. And the way that I ended up tackling that was really to start self-publishing. So I've been blogging for, well over a decade.
Hmm.
Because I decided for myself, I'm not going to wait for someone else to tell me my work is of value to have it published. I'm just going to publish it. So I've had several blogs over the years, one of which kind of became the basis of this book, to some degree. It's a very different flavor of the topic, but I used to host a blog, for instance, about outdoor parenting.
Interesting. Okay.
And so I think there is some degree of, we all have to kind of toil and,
Yes.
you know, you have the several years of, how do you make connections? And then suddenly you just do. You have those connections. But a lot of it has just been choosing to stick my neck out there and talk to people and not be afraid to ask for things.
Hmm.
And then there's been a few angels along the way who've kind of taken me under their wing because I'm showing that I'm passionate. But I think now that, Paul and I are kind of 15 years into our careers, we have a series of criteria that we use to decide whether or not we're going to take on a gig. And, one of the first things to do is to actually look at your schedule and decide if it's sane
Yes.
to do it. Like, do we even have the time? Because before you decide if it's pays enough or it's something you want to do, it's like that's a very easy way to decide that you can actually do it.
Interesting.
The second is we have kind of a minimum amount that we're willing to work for. It's a sliding scale, of course,
Mhm.
depending on the client and depending on the nature of the work. And, if it's a nonprofit versus a corporation versus a publication, it's a sliding scale.
But finding that value in who you are and what your worth is, that is a journey on its own, isn't it?
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
and I always say is yesterday's price is not today's price.
No, and you're just gradually nudging it up. It's like you just gradually, you have to start somewhere.
Hmm.
And that's always the question we get from people is how do I put a price on this? How do I even know how much I'm
Hmm.
worth? But, over the years, I just kind of keep nudging that upwards because also my time becomes more valuable.
Yeah.
So, that's definitely the second one is, okay, this is enough. And then the third criteria is really, is this something that I really want to do? Am I passionate about this project? Am I, because that's where a lot of the motivation comes from beyond the pay. It's, is this a topic that I'm passionate about or something I really want to go photograph? And, we kind of weigh those together. And actually, Paul and I have a Monday meeting whenever he's actually in town. We have a Monday meeting to discuss any prospective clients or projects so that there's a sounding board. It's a discussion every single time
Hmm.
that somebody comes knocking. And that allows us to work together to decide what we're going to do. And so I would encourage people if maybe they don't have a partner who does that. I think he and I are a little bit rare that way, but find someone in your life, whether it's another creative person that you can bounce these gigs off of and weigh them because it is worth taking the time. And I'll finish with this. Something that I'll often ask Paul, let's say if something comes his way, is imagine yourself, just 3 days before this gig is about to happen. And if you can, imagine it. Are you dreading it or are you excited about it? Are you glad you took it on? Or after all these other things have
Hmm.
happened and you've got other responsibilities and say you've just finished that workshop, how can you imagine you're going to feel about it?
That's a really good way to look at it because, yeah, you're right. Oftentimes, it's like, oh my God, we got to do this. Why are you doing it then? You have a choice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What was it like to, before we get going here, the power of no and taking that time back? And 'cause it's so easy to say yes and get carried away with whatever it is, creative work or even going out with friends, even, right? How do you
Mm-hmm.
protect your energy and your time and say, no, I need me time?
It's a really good question, and it's also tricky because it's about saying no to some things and yes to others. So saying yes to yourself. Um, I wish I had it in front of me right now, but there's a quote in Glennon Doyle's book Untamed
Okay.
about essentially, disappointing as many people as possible so that you don't disappoint yourself, or to put it differently, saying no to others so that you're not saying no to yourself. And actually, last year, I think it was in November, there's kind of a trend where people can do what's called November. So it's taking the month of November
Okay.
to decide I'm going to say no to these things.
Oh, wow.
And I think it's a daily practice. And it's even sometimes for me an hourly practice
Mm.
of no, I'm not going to bother worrying about the fact that my kids left their dishes on the counter when it's an expectation to put them in the sink. because that's just energy that I'm going to put out there that, eventually they'll do it every time. But today I'm going to choose, no, I'm not going to worry about that. Or it can be, no, I'm going to say no to that job because as much as it sounds like a once in a lifetime opportunity, when I think about everything it'll involve, it's actually going to take away from everything I'm working towards right now. And so I think these are very individual decisions that people have to make, because what's a no for one person isn't a no for another.
Yeah.
But whenever I do say no, I take the time to actually feel it in my body. And I can also, our bodies remember things just as much as our words and our minds do. And so I take time to consider how that feels as an indicator of, ultimately what the payoff was for that decision. Because I know what it feels like when I've said a yes to the wrong things.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you on that. The dreadful feeling. Well, Meghan, thank you for today. I appreciate your time.
No, thanks so
I think
much for having me on.